welcome to the Chicago Humanities Festival and today's program, Sarah Broom and Natasha Trethewey on memoir. My name is Daniela Mazio and I'm the Audience Engagement Manager here at CHF. You can learn more about upcoming programs by visiting chicagohumanities.org, and you can support CHF by donating or becoming a member. Now, without further ado, please help me welcome Allison Cuddy, Sarah Broom, and Natasha Trethewey.
Thank you so much, Daniela, and hi everyone. It's great to be here with you this evening. I've been reflecting and feel very fortunate that during this festival season, among all the different programs we've been doing, we've had some just incredible conversations between women. We had Chris Ray and Jennifer Reeder talking about being independent filmmakers in Chicago and directors in the world of film writ large. Last week, we had Claudia Rankine and Eula Biss talking about race and whiteness, particularly in the context of property. We have a program coming up with the translator of Elena Ferrante's work and a group of women who are admirers of her work. And in this moment, I think hearing the creativity, the wisdom, the intelligence of women is so critical. We have so much to learn from those voices, and particularly in thinking about the impact of what we call kind of as a shorthand, Me Too or Black Lives Matter, the way in which structural sexism and racism, and sometimes as a tag team, have worked to stifle women's creativity. And so I'm just feeling very grateful for the voices of the women that are coming together and the voices of women that they're bringing to us, particularly in the case of Natasha Trethewey and Sarah Broom and their books, Memorial Drive and The Yellow House, respectively. So Natasha and Sarah, it's so great to be here with you this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Allison. Thank you for having us.
I wanted to start, so the goal is to really have you two be in conversation. So I'm going to try and stay out of the way as much as I can. And we definitely want to take questions from those of you watching. So please share your questions in the YouTube chat, and we'll try to get to some of them as we go through the evening. But I wanted to have you start by talking about your connection to one another and how you know each other, what you know of each other's work, and how it resonates with you. And Natasha, would you do the honor of starting us off by talking about your connection to Sarah?
Sure. I think my connections to you, Sarah, run deep, even though I haven't known you very long at all. Sarah and I met, we're just trying to think, I think it was in February, in California for a conversation not unlike this one, that started not unlike this one back in the green room, and spilled over onto the stage. But even from that very moment, and from having, I'd already read her wonderful book, The Yellow House, so I felt like I had grown up, if not exactly in her family, but next door to her family. And I think maybe that we might even have the same grandmother. We're going to have to talk about your Lolo and my Nana. Yes, yes.
It's interesting because when I met you, I remembered, it's one thing to have been reading someone for a very long time and then to meet them. And often when I've read someone, as much as I have read you, I'm not that interested in meeting them, right? Because I don't want to be disappointed by them. But there's such kindness in you and such seeing. And I think that's the thing I felt when I first saw you. So I felt that I knew you. And I do feel like we are somehow in the same family. And, but also more personally, you've accompanied me as a Black woman aiming to be a writer. You have been my accompaniment. So thank you for that. I just want to thank you for that.
Well, thank you. You're right. When we saw each other, this is why I have this, because I cried then and I'll probably cry again now. But, to talk about, kindness and warmth, you just exuded that. I think that's what made me feel, like, okay, I can have this conversation because I feel you're an old soul that I've known for a long time. Okay, so before I get too emotional here, I do need to, I want to, there's so many things that I underline when I talk about this sort of feeling of sort of being in your family, or at least very connected to what people in your family imparted to you that I've carried with me. And it's first that love of beauty and beautiful things, which I guess comes from your great grandmother. Is that right? And then,
Yeah.
yeah. So, I get it from my grandmother, Loretta, who we called Lee, and makes it, and I think about your Lolo. But it wasn't just those beautiful things that my grandmother would acquire, make. She was a seamstress, she sewed a lot of things. And she always gave them to me. She wanted, me to have them. And even though they were the things that you put away for some other use, she would let me use them as for everyday use. She denied them to herself, but gave them always to me. And in that way, reminded me so much of your great grandmother and grandmother. I don't see you right now. Have we lost Sarah?
I'm muted. It looks like we have lost Sarah for a moment, so we'll work to, oh, here she
There
is.
she is. Okay.
For a moment.
I'm sorry. I'm not sure what happened.
I just kept talking about your grandmother and your great grandmother and their love of beauty and making beautiful things. And I was just saying how my grandmother, was a drapery seamstress, and she also sewed our clothing. And so that was something that we had in common too, wearing those clothes that had been made in the family. My mother had clothes made by her, and then I had clothes that she made. Very much like what you describe.
I mean, it's so interesting because thinking about the things we put on, the things we wear, and now I understand so much more the significance of some of these clothes, because I have, for instance, a dress from my grandmother Lolo, and I love this dress. I go up and down in sizes, and sometimes it's tight and sometimes it's really loose. But just knowing that she wore it and that she made it for herself, I feel like sometimes when we're talking about this kind of, often people will say to me, well, these women in your book, they seem very sort of worried about what other people think. And isn't that why they care so much about looking a certain way? And I say, and I think I feel that to actually believe that dismisses the great art of what it meant to make these things in the first place with your own hands.
Right.
Well,
I think it was a way too, when I think about my grandmother, of, making art is a way of survival. It is a way to keep going in spite of all the things that would disrupt your ability to carry on. Like when we lost my mother, my grandmother went back to work. She went back to her sewing machine and made beautiful things. I think that's how she survived it. But also, what, as you were saying, what you put on, I mean, it is quite obviously a kind of armor. You put on what you want to present and how you want to present yourself to the world, which is why it isn't simply about the clothes, but how one carries oneself. And, one of the pages, that I underlined in your book was this part where it's on page 29. And you're quoting, "We would buy ourselves barrettes. I used to always pick nice colors. We were always neat kids. We used to look like we were more kept than the other kids that would be around us, like little rich kids." This is exactly sort of what my grandmother was trying to cloak me in, because she knew that for me as a Black biracial child in Mississippi, what it was going to be like for me to walk down the street. And what follows is even just like my grandmother, hold your heads up, grandmother was always saying. If they didn't have a penny in their pocket, no one had to know that. It's how you carry yourself.
Yeah.
To my grandmother's dying day, I mean, she would be in a wheelchair. She had to evacuate, Mississippi because of Hurricane Katrina. She
Yeah.
spent the last of her days in Atlanta in a nursing home. And I would take her for as if she would be held so the way she carried herself, that pride means so much to me.
Hi, I think we're having technical difficulties. There's a instability or something, so I'm sure Sarah will join us again to talk about this. Can I ask you a question related to that, Natasha, while we wait? Because one of the questions I wanted to ask, and thinking about some of the connections between your work and Sarah's, is all the different elements that you bring into these texts that sort of really push us beyond a standard memoir, different kinds of transcripts of conversations, investigations that you both do, and different mediums. And one of them is photography. Throughout Sarah's book, she has photographs, but you have these very vivid descriptions of photographs and your mother's presentation and self-presentation. You start the book with one. There are some throughout. Sarah, thanks for coming back. Sorry about the technical difficulties.
Problems with Zoom. I don't know.
Yeah, this is the drawback. It's both intimate but fraught. I was just jumping off the conversation you were having to ask about the role of photography in both of your books, that you have these photographs in terms of thinking about self-presentation and representation, and asking Natasha to maybe start talking about that, because I just was struck by the vivid, there's obviously a photograph of you and your mother on the cover, but the vividness of the portraits you create by studying photographs of your mother. And then Sarah, the kind of the photographs you literally bring in the text. If you could both talk about the role of photography in reconstructing these stories in that world that you both were talking about so beautifully.
Well, I'll just say, because I feel like I've talked too much. I'll just say that, from an early age, I started recording things photographically in my head. And I sort of talk about this, in Memorial Drive, that I could remember every inch of my grandmother's house and describe it in great detail because I thought I needed to hold on to it. I was trying to save it, and when I moved to Atlanta, so I wouldn't forget it. And so being able to remember, in a photograph was one of the ways that I held on to those things. And it's helped because, I look at all the wonderful photographs in Sarah's book, and I don't have as many photographs. My grandmother, we lost so much. And I'm imagining, you lost so much in the Yellow House, obviously, but so much of these photographs I don't have anymore, but for how I remember them.
I mean, that's interesting. And, there's this wonderful way you describe your mother in the portrait studio in the beginning of Memorial Drive. And it reminded me so much of this thing I discovered writing The Yellow House, when there's a moment when I say my father is 6 pictures, and the kind of, that makes me feel so sad, really, because you start to realize the kind of the ways in which pictures don't actually do very much when you are grieving someone sometimes. And that one could use the photo, though, to not just see what was there, but to actually imagine what was not there.
Yeah.
And that act, that process, that work could in fact help me personally get closer to what was missing or what was lost. And so I'm really interested in using the photographs, not to necessarily look at what I can see, but to have them give me clues from what I maybe cannot see.
Yeah.
And, you know, if you're in a moment of joy, what brought that on, right? What was the scene in the room that day? And I look, I think, at my photographs a lot differently for that reason now, because I got so close to discovering my father
Yeah.
in an archive. It was so important for me to feel that I had found him, and then to understand the kind of baseness on some level of the artifact, of the evidence itself.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, you know, what's deeply, I absolutely agree with you. I have always been interested in the absences too that photographs suggest, you know, including what's just outside of the frame, what's been somehow cropped out,
Mm.
what's happened just before or just after. And mainly, you know, you said that they're also very sad. I mean, I think that photographs for me are always deeply elegiac because, you know, I think living so long in a state of bereavement, when I look back at the old photographs, all I can think about is how much more I know now about what was going to happen to those people in those photographs who had no
Mm.
idea what was coming. And I look at them and their innocence and their not knowing, and it breaks my heart.
I mean, this is in a way also what you're talking about goes back to the idea of beauty, which I think involves a kind of presence that you're required to have, right? And photographs for those people in that particular moment are an artifact of the present.
Yeah.
And the present.
Oh, so sorry, everyone. Sorry, Natasha. It looks like there's some, again, technical, there's something wrong with the connection. I'm so sorry. I hate to have this interrupting the two of you in such a beautiful conversation.
Well, maybe it'll give me a chance.
Knowing what's to come for the subjects in those photos, then they don't know themselves. There's an innocence. There's a line in Sarah's book, and this made me think a lot about form, where she's talking about how oh,
Okay, I'm going to blame this on my New Orleans internet connection.
well, I guess that's fitting that you're in New Orleans, and that is a very strong connection between the two of you and your writing and all of that.
Yeah.
Why don't you, I was going to ask a question, but I'd love for you to finish your thought because you were in the midst of something really amazing.
Well, I was going to say, I think what's interesting about the present, especially as it relates to the idea of beauty, is that when you're actually in it, you're just in it, right? And the moment contains so much in and of itself that you actually don't need anything more beyond it. And I'm also interested in the ways in which photographs are also that in that moment, that someone can actually be just representing and containing whatever they feel then, that they don't have to think about what comes next.
Yeah.
Right? And that is also very beautiful.
Yeah. You know, I think what comes next is what we're left with when we look at them.
Yes.
It's also the task of both your work, right? That reconstruction to move beyond or fill in that moment or connect it up to other moments and other stories. And that was the question I was starting to ask, because when Natasha was talking about looking at photos and knowing more than the subjects of those photos know of what's to come and the kind of tragedy and sorrow of that, it reminded me of a line in your book, Sarah, and which is, and you both write about this, you know, Natasha, you write, to survive trauma, one must be able to tell a story about it. And Sarah, you write this great, you talk about, in a cacophony of siblings, you have many brothers and sisters. It's a matter of survival to make your voice heard, to have a point of view. And then you say, but also in the process of telling the stories of those that composed you is an upending of the natural order of things. And that line to me sort of resonated with what you were saying, Natasha, that upending of the natural order of things. And I wondered if you could both talk about how you approach that kind of task, right? That daunting task, how you started to think about translating those moments into a narrative, those experiences into art, into books that we could all experience as well. Like, what were some of the thoughts and feelings you had as you started to approach that?
Well, that's interesting.
Mhm. Ending the narrative.
Because there is something that it makes me think about relative to Natasha's work, and particularly in Memorial Drive, because she talks about the wound that never heals. And it made me think about this question I keep asking when I'm in the Yellow House as a book process. You know, can I resurrect a house with words? I mean, there's one sentence in the book, but I think it was the thing I asked myself every day when I showed up to work. Can I resurrect a house with words? Can I resurrect a house with words? And this idea of the wound that never heals makes me think about, well, makes me wonder whether art can.
Oh my God. Question. As I think about upending the narrative, and to what Sarah was just saying, as I think about that wound that never heals, and her trying to resurrect a house in language, and the house's absence now is like the physical manifestation on the landscape of that wound that never heals. There she is. She's back again.
I'm sitting on top of the Wi-Fi box now.
Okay, that's a good idea. Okay, I was just trying to keep going until you got back. So if you want to.
Well, I was going to say, you know, can art actually redress? Right? Can it repair? What is it able to do? And that feels very connected to this question of feeling that somehow I was upending the natural order of things, because the act of storytelling itself is to sort of create and compose a narrative that is, in a way, it's sort of, I think for me, I felt like it was a way of redressing something in me that needed it, right? But it wasn't necessarily the true story. It was as true as I could possibly get to it. But it didn't, in some way, satisfy ultimately, because it can only try to move toward an understanding of a thing, which by the end of the book felt to me, and I wonder, Natasha, what it felt like to you, so big that it almost exceeded, you know, the actual book I made. I felt more distant from my central question in a way by the end.
Yeah, you know, that for me, that upending the natural order has so much to do with how I wanted to tell this story and what story I ended up telling, because the story I tell is not at all the story I wanted to tell. What I wanted to do was something so much more in depth. I think, like Sarah's book, something that could go and encompass so much. I wanted to tell my mother's story as if I were a biographer. I wanted to do research. I wanted to research her life and try to present as full a portrait of it as I could. And I realized that I couldn't do that. I could spend the rest of my life trying to kind of do the research that I would need to try to do that, uh, to do that, just to give it, to justify trying to do it like that. So instead, I realized that what I could do was tell a story about her through the lens of a bereft daughter. That was the closest portrait of who she was that I could manage. But I still felt like, and I think this sort of maybe upends the natural order of a memoir. I mean, if this is my memoir, then it's supposed to be my voice. But I decided, to get out of the way a lot in the second half and just let my mother's voice emerge, because I had all those documents, because I had all the documentary evidence. You could hear her talking about her life in her own words. So I try to let her take over, because what I could do would never be enough to bring her back fully the way I want.
I mean, Natasha, that's so interesting to me because I was thinking about how I arrived at the point where I decided to let my mother's voice be heard. And I think for me, my mother is still alive now. She's on the cusp of 80.
I'm so sorry about this. Um, uh, yeah, we were talking about making your mother's presence felt. Natasha, if you don't mind, that was an actual question I had for both you and Sarah, and the ways in which memory is physical. I thought there's something so powerful about the way you and Sarah both come close to that physicality. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, so sorry, guys. This is terrible.
Well, I think we can keep going, and if it continue, maybe we'll draw the conversation to an end. I hate to do that though. So I'll leave it to you because I don't want this to interfere with your communication with one another. But
And there's also I'm seeing that I could maybe log on using my phone, that might actually be more stable. So
Yeah.
I might actually try that.
okay. So while you're doing that, I was just saying that I had a question literally about what you're talking about, was how you went about work to make your mother's presence felt and heard in these books, because you both write so beautifully about their physical presence and your memory of them as physical, remembering the rise and fall of your mother's belly, Sarah, as you're lying with her learning Spanish, or, Natasha on a different register in a very painful moment when you find that tape of your mother's voice and you're trying to play it and it breaks, and you write, the length of tape that held her voice had been as tenuous as the faith that held Orpheus and Eurydice together as he tried to lead her out of the underworld, which is just this incredibly profound and the drama of that moment. And could you talk a little bit about you were talking about the evidence and the documents you found that allowed you to bring your mother's voice in. Can you talk a bit about what those are for those who are watching this? Some of the texts that you were able to use that literally brought your mother's voice to life.
I used, there was a 13-page document that was found in her briefcase the morning that she was murdered. It reads as if she were writing a brief narrative, a speech that she might have given to a shelter for battered women, to talk about the role of these kinds of places for helping women in situations like hers. She was writing something that she would be an advocate. I also have her statement to the police the first time he tried to kill her. I have transcripts of the recorded phone conversations the 2 days leading up to her death, where she was trying to get the judge to order an arrest warrant for him, and she had to get this evidence. So that's the kind of thing that I have. Sarah, before you went, the last time you had just started talking about your mother, being alive, but
Mhm.
still trying to capture and how you give us her voice. I was wondering if you might go on with that.
Yeah, I remember the moment I was transcribing these interviews that I had done, and you know, typing them and then compiling them in a book, which became its own book, this binder with 400 pages of my mother's voice in it. And I kept thinking about the irony that here I was, a writer, and my mother gave me a kind of sound, a way with which to think about language and with which to think about words. And there were ways that she could say things that I couldn't paraphrase, that my paraphrases were far less powerful. And I kept thinking about this kind of idea of longevity, that if her words were in a book, right, that would sort of give her length. And I remember saying to her, I want everyone to know your name. And my mother saying, I don't really care about that, but just having her exist on the page in her own words. And how she brought, I think, the work alive in a way that I alone could not. And so that I was actually able to make the point that these women compose me. This woman actually composes me, because here she is on the page, and I am the result, right, of her.
Yeah, that's why I use that epigraph from Shakespeare, "Thou art thy mother's glass, and she in thee calls back the lovely April of her prime." I
I
feel
love
very much
that.
composed by my mother, same
Yes.
way. And just like you, I want her to be known. And
Mm-hmm.
I think, to your earlier point, that is a kind of redress. Um,
Mm-hmm.
if your project was to resurrect the Yellow House
Mm-hmm.
and what it contained,
Mm-hmm.
mine was to try to in some way resurrect her enough that through these pages, people who would not have known her otherwise would get a glimpse of who she was.
Yes.
That would be a little bit less oblivion, um,
Mm-hmm.
that they would know her and know her name and
Mm-hmm.
and her voice.
Yes. Which really is there. This, I mentioned this in the green room, but I want to mention it again now because it's something I love about all of your work, but I think particularly in Memorial Drive, there's this idea, and I'm interested in how you use this idea of traces, right? In our traces, both of us in our traces. I'm particularly obsessed with the idea of traces. I think not just in the Yellow House, but in everything I do, I'm interested in the
Yeah,
traces left by,
yeah,
right? Um, the sort of ways in which traces can be so missed if you don't look closely or if you don't rub your hand along something, right? Could you talk about traces and what it sort of indicates and means for you?
yeah. I think about it in two ways. One, as you're saying, um, the residue that we might find,
Mm-hmm.
um, when we catch small glimpses of something. Like I bear the traces of my mother, on my body all the time. That
Mm-hmm.
moment you walk past the mirror, and for a moment you have to do a double take because it's your
Mm-hmm.
mother's face that you see.
Yeah.
So there are all those kinds of traces, but I open the book with us walking side by side, um, neither of us speaking, both of us in our traces. And when I started there, I am sort of starting with this notion of which is it's what I can't let go of in the book because I needed to make story so much. The idea of a path that's already been laid for us, that we're on our separate tracks, our traces, and it's a kind of destiny that we are headed for where we are headed. And that's not going to change. And I don't believe that in the most literal sense. I don't believe in fate in that way. But when you're telling a story, when you look back at all these events, it's easier to look at trace events and to see how they were all leading up to what ultimately occurred. That's what it means, I think, to create a narrative out of the past, and particularly one that is disruptive and seemingly chaotic. If I couldn't have put us in our traces and told a story that was, I think, mythic even, then it would seem merely that her death was random and senseless. If we're in our traces, if there is a design for us that we follow, then there's more meaning, even in tragedy.
Wow. You know, I really understand that actually. But it makes me think about too, how you create an architecture for a work, right? And you've had to do it a few times. But when I think about the Yellow House, I think about how, for me, the architecture of the work itself carries the narrative for me, right? So when people ask me, oh, was it emotional to write? I say, not at all, because I was too busy trying to build this goddamn boat,
Yes.
you know?
Yes.
And when you're trying to build a boat, you're not weeping over that.
Yeah.
If you're weeping, it's because it's so damn hard to make this specific arc happen, right? I wonder, because when you talk about traces and you talk about everything that it means for you, which is really deep, I think about architecture, structure. How is the story contained?
Yeah.
What's carrying it?
Yeah. I mean, I'm so glad you brought that up. I was going to ask you about architecture in your book, but it is so true that, if I do an interview or have a conversation like this and I start talking about my mother, that is when I weep. If I talk about architecture and structure, I'm not weeping then, because it is about form. It's about how you do the thing. The thing does what it does. People read it, but how did you do it? And it's not simply just emoting at all. It's more about building. And so I would like to hear you talk a little bit more about, building, the thing that they say in creative writing. I always say this about a poem or a narrative is a house that you build for yourself that ultimately the reader will inhabit. And so, you built a house that from memories of the house you lived in, you built a house that we as readers inhabit in the architecture of this book. So how did you, what were some of the main building parts of it that you were thinking, ordering?
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. And I mean, you'll understand this. One of the tricky things about having written a book is that you immediately try to forget what you went through so that you can make the next one. But I have been thinking a lot about this because I think I really love structure and I love architecture. But I remember for this book, getting a stack of index cards and writing out the name, writing the names of the room and literally laying out the index cards on the floor so that they resembled the shape of the house, right? This was such a tactile process. So to move from, the living room to the bedroom, to the kitchen, to the girls' room, to the den, to the main bathroom, right? To the boys' room upstairs. And trying to think about, okay, what would the journey be like? What where do I create a kind of threshold in the work itself, where
Yes.
you have to kind of stop, where you know you need to know a set of things, right, before we go into the bedroom, which is your most private place. What do you need to know? How long? You know, how do you get the reader to sort of stop and look around, to be in this narrative of a place and really take in the place in a new and different way. And you know, I was thinking a lot also about what it means for me to be a child of New Orleans, to be from this city, to belong to this city, for better and for worse, the
Mhm.
same way we belong to the people we come from, for
Yeah.
better and for worse. And how do I sort of build into the structure of the book itself this kind of way that we have of being musical and having ritual and attending to the details of a thing, right? The sort of granularity that I think the people I know in New Orleans really love, this attention to detail, right? Um, and I think what became very hard for me though was I was coming upon a kind of book style, I'll call it, in the process of writing, which is that I had only before that moment written, you know, articles, or I had never written a book before.
Mhm.
And so with all this space and all this so-called land,
Yeah.
I was like, oh, so really my style is to just lay a thing on top of a thing, on top of another thing, on top of another thing,
Uh-huh.
and see what seeps through the cracks. You
Right.
know, what I can see, how the ways in which those layered things intersect and lay on each other,
Mhm.
right? And that sort of gave me a sense of the world of the book,
Mhm.
and how the job then in terms of architecture
Mhm.
was figuring out how to bury all those signifiers sort of underneath. You know what I mean? So the first 5 drafts were just ideas laying on top. You know, I want to talk about home. I want to talk about displacement. I want to talk about possession. I want to talk about geography. But
Mhm.
I think in the last mini drafts, I was so into the architecture. What are the beams? What's underneath? What's the foundation? What's buried? How does the reader feel in a world that is fragile and turned upside down
Mhm.
in so many ways, that they're walking on solid ground,
Yeah.
right? And I think the work of that was really the most frustrating part of putting it together, because it fell apart a lot of times. And it took a lot of, I think, finesse to know what needed to stay, what was the supporting beam, you know, what wall could just come down. And a lot of courage, frankly, to keep going at something that, you know, you're doing for the first time, which is the first book experience.
Well, but I just love how you describe it because I mean to use this metaphor of architecture and the rooms and I can't stop thinking about how houses up on blocks not having that kind of solid foundation that connects them to the ground and
Mm,
they're up. I mean my grandmother's house was a house like that, but
yeah.
that you found the perfect metaphor for writing also about a book, about a house and a family and a history that belongs to
Mm.
it. It seems, like destiny, like you were in your choices when you
I love that.
started writing
In
that.
my That's going to be the next title of my book, In My Traces. I
You
love that. I think.
early on you said I said it comes from my father because my father's first chapbook of poems was called In the Traces,
Wow.
so it probably goes back to that. But you early on you mentioned threshold, and I think
Mm,
threshold was the kind of guiding structural principle for me because
mm,
uh, for me, there was the threshold between my former life before my mother was gone, and then my life afterwards. And that also, for me, connects to being from the Mississippi Gulf Coast. You know, I was 3 years old when Hurricane Camille hit, which is, I guess, was
Mm,
New Orleans' Betsy.
yeah.
But Hurricane Camille, and I grew up with people with the threshold of that, where people would talk about the Mississippi Gulf Coast um, before Camille and after Camille. So there was
Mm,
BC and AC, and everything hinged at the threshold between those two things.
mm,
Until, of course, Katrina. And then
right.
everything changed with how we remembered that. But that threshold for me, and so, you know, I was trying to write about, you know, what was on either side of those thresholds. And I do this kind of I guess weird thing where I use brackets
Mm,
in
yeah,
the beginning
yeah,
of
I
some
saw that.
small
Yeah.
chapters instead of titles, and those kind of interstitial moments that the brackets are supposed to represent have everything to do with the interruptions to the process of creating the architecture. What is
Oh,
interrupting the attempt to tell this story? So sometimes it's a dream that intersects in my ability in my attempt to do this. Other times it's a fire. Everything
mm,
that was sort of getting in the way of trying to cross that threshold and tell that story.
wow. I mean, it's interesting because this book for me felt like such a choral exercise
Yeah.
because I was thinking and a little bit taken with not just the voices of the people I know, my family members,
Yeah.
but the voices of all of the neighbors and the voices of the writers who were guiding me in some way. And it's funny when you talk about the brackets and the work that they're doing because there were times when I was wanting a lot more freedom, so that one chapter became the next without interruption, you
Uh-huh.
know. um, it was reminding me of a kind of scene where 50 people could be at one table talking over one another and at the same time, and you would still know what every person was saying.
Mhm.
And I kept wishing I could sort of do that on the
Yes.
page, that it could be overwhelmed, you know, by the fact that the sound of Lil Wayne was so deep in me in the same way that the sound of, Gaston Bachelard was deep in me. And that the fusions of those people talking at once and maybe over each other might lead me someplace, Um, so it's wonderful to hear you also talking about threshold. And I think I was thinking about this with your book and with some of your poetry too. Like in Monument, for instance, which is, like I told you, I really, really, there are a few books I want to wear around my neck, and that's one of them.
Yeah.
Um, Graveyard Blues, in this moment when you talk about naming it, for me that's really a poem about naming. um, and I was really interested in naming
Mhm.
because I felt that I came from a place that was name called. you know we were constantly being called things by so many people, known and unknown. What happens when someone name calls you? What happens also when, as my grandmother did, moved into a community of women who renamed themselves
Yeah. Yeah.
and said, don't call me that, call me this.
Mhm.
And that's the bottom line.
Mhm.
This idea of naming, of being named, of giving yourself a new name. of calling someone's name who you love.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes me think about your two names that you
Mm.
talked about, and I'm assuming that there are places where you still go by the familial name,
Mm-hmm.
not the name that you carry now.
Right.
Um, y- and it's so meaningful because you can just inhabit, the name in a different way. I
Mm-hmm.
talk a little bit about um, that kind of naming as well, but particularly, my father is the one who, named me Natasha. He was reading War and Peace, but he
Mm.
also is the one who gave me my kind of second name, which is Cassandra,
Mm.
because he was in
Oh.
writing his, sort of thinly veiled accounts of our lives when he was writing fiction. He named me Cassandra. And just by
Mm.
telling me that and telling me that Cassandra was a prophet that no one believed, it it was a great sort of burden on my shoulders because it made me feel that I carried that ability, that of kind
Mm.
of foresight. But of course, it goes along with how I was talking about fate and one's destiny, but how we embody and inhabit the names that we are given.
Mm.
Too, this is something totally different, and I wonder if you talk to people, who've read the book, who are uh, from New Orleans or have spent a great deal of time in New Orleans. Um, I found reading it and traversing the geography that you cover took me back to so many memories because I know exactly where New Orleans East is because you
Mm-hmm.
kind of have to, well, I would encounter going over it somehow or
Mm-hmm.
through it,
Yeah.
and the bridge going back to Gulfport,
Yeah.
between Gulfport and New Orleans, and how very different you make it when you move down to the quarter.
Mm.
Just a whole other world. And this is something I didn't know until you bring it up in the book, how distant a lot of Black New Orleanians feel from the quarter, which is a place
Mm-hmm.
that they go to work.
Mm-hmm.
Um, my mother was born down there on Dumaine Street, but
Wow, I know Dumaine very
and,
well.
and never had, she never wanted any connection to it for whatever
Mm.
reason. But this is where my grandmother lived in
Mm.
the 40s. Um, I don't know. I don't know what I'm even asking, but I'm just talking about how vividly you created those places and the distinctions between the two.
Mhm. Well,
I
it's
don't-
interesting that you mentioned Dumaine, Natasha, because one of the things I found out researching the history of the French Quarter was that, there were many people of color who lived in it in the earlier days. And I was really intrigued by how places transform
Yeah,
and transfigure and how these sort of stories get built up around the places as they change, and how a place that is absolutely belongs to, right, like Black people or even free people of color
yeah,
becomes this prohibitive place suddenly.
yeah,
And we see often in our communities the ways that the so-called scary places are kind of uh, they morph into the most sought after places,
right.
and that's literally a narrative shift, right?
Yep.
It is a demonstration of the power of the story you tell, and of course the money you're now investing
Yeah.
in
And
that
then you
better.
went and you went and moved into that place.
Yeah.
And was there while working on this story. I mean,
So I needed that because I think I was thinking a lot about bifurcation
Yeah.
about duality and all these ways that I sort of put myself in positions where I was in one place considering the other.
Yeah.
It kept reminding me of what the writer Andre Aciman does. He's always, in every book he writes, he's sort of in New York thinking about Milan. He's in Milan longing for Rome. He's always elsewhere,
Yeah.
right? He's in
Right.
Egypt, yearning for this place. And so it's like, I think as an exercise, it gave me a way of inhabiting one place with my mind being elsewhere. And it was actually useful because in the Yellow House, it allowed me to note the difference in a very humanistic way, to note the distance, to say, here's what it takes for me to see the people I love most. And for me, that moment came most succinctly when my brother Carl, called me from the East and said, Mo, calling me by my familial name, Mo, the marshes are burning. We have smoke instead of sun in the sky. And meanwhile, I'm sitting on the balcony and the brass band is setting up downstairs and there's the lemony street cleaning smell in the air and the bougainvillea is growing. And I'm like, he's calling from another goddamn planet.
Right.
He has to be.
Yeah. Because it wasn't.
Right?
I want to ask a question from someone watching. I'm sorry to interrupt.
I realize we've gone.
You were talking about Andre Aciman, he's the author of Call Me by Your Name.
And Out of Egypt.
Yeah. And we got a question from Laura Joyce Hubbard, who's saying, this is the third interview I've seen. I'm always moved by Natasha's bravery. And you were talking also, Sarah, about courage, that you're so inspirational to Laura, Natasha, and she wanted both of you to speak to what literature or other areas give both of you inspiration to write through this moment. And by moment, I'm not sure if she means the moment that is the moment of your books or the moment that we're in now, but definitely I think your conversation you're having right now is also about the moment we're in right now. So I wondered if you could talk to that question. Maybe Natasha, you could start. What literature, what is giving you inspiration to write through this moment, however you want to think of this moment?
Oh, there is a poem that I go back to again and again that I think always speaks to me about our tumultuous times, and they're always tumultuous. And that it's a poem called "When I'm Asked" by Liesl Mueller, who I first saw her read this poem on the news. I don't know, maybe 1998 or something like that. And it just hit me like lightning because, the poem begins, when I'm asked how I began writing poetry, I talk about the indifference of nature. So she goes on to describe in the poem a June day that her, not long after her own mother had died. And it's a glorious June day. And the sun is shining and the world seems to be going on as if nothing has happened. And there she is, in the aftermath of this loss, grieving. And the world goes by without noticing it. And the poem ends, so I placed my grief in the mouth of language, the only thing that would grieve with me. And in a moment like this, where we could have glorious days, like a glorious, beautiful fall day, and there's still people dying. Nature looks indifferent, but we don't have to be.
That's brilliant. I mean, for me, I think I write with and among women like the woman who just spoke. And I think that's the job and the goal. And You know, when I think of that question, I feel that I'm somehow in a firmament of writers. And so there's writers, Natasha Trethewey is one, but then also people like Imani Perry, and I think of Gail Jones, and I think of Disha Philyaw. I think of Angela Flournoy. I think of Caitlin Greenidge. I think of June Jordan. I think of Sadia Hartman. I think of Wendy S. Walters and Casey Lehman and Jason Reynolds. And that's my firmament and my Congress. And whether I know them or not, I'm in some kind of conversation with them and thus am not alone. And I think I write and gain whatever courage I need in the act of writing through that.
Isn't it wonderful how all those people that you love and read, as you say, they are with you every time you sit down to write.
Yes.
And both on a conscious level, but even better when you've read them so much that they inhabit your subconscious.
Mm.
And their brilliance lights a little up inside of you that helps you when you move along.
Yes. I think that's true. I think, and also just the kind of musicality so inherent in the act of writing.
Yeah.
That we can kind of play words. I mean, Toni Morrison does it. I mean, and we say like you're stunting, and in the book Jazz, she's completely stunting because it's every kind of music imaginable, right? And I was just reading Albert Murray again the other day, and I was just like, this instrument here, right? So yeah, that part is
okay. You just made me want to ask you something. And I know we're going to have to wrap this up, but I just have to ask this, okay? Because I wanted to know this about New Orleans and your growing up. On page 138, at the very bottom, you're talking about the verbal games. You don't want to teach yourself into a physical fight, just verbal spar hard and loud enough. And so you have a few phrases that people would, each of these things would begin. Now, because I lived in two different places, I had to learn two different words for what that was called. And I want to know what y'all call that. If you had a name for.
Oh, for what that was called? I think
yeah, like that kind of play in the dozens. Did you call it something in New Orleans?
We called it ribbing.
Ribbing?
Yeah.
With B's, yeah, or
like
P.
RIBB.
Okay.
ING.
Yeah. Okay. Because see, in Mississippi, it was janking.
Oh, interesting.
And then when I moved to Atlanta, it was joning.
Oh.
Yeah.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, I am very interested in the different ways that we call that game, and what you learn being able to play it.
Well, that it's interesting because I was thinking about that watching the debate last night, and how bad they are and were at it.
Yeah.
And I just kept going, wow, like the verbal astuteness, it's just not there. You know
what I would like to do is just have every radio station, every TV station right now, instead of another debate, just air like James Baldwin and William F. Buckley debated in Oxford, so that people see what a debate actually
right. Okay, this is genius. This needs to happen.
We need to educate people about what a debate should really look like.
And I was thinking, and I know we have to end, Allison, but this idea of yes, okay,
but then I'll ask my question.
I was going to talk about words real quick, and just like vocabulary and the deficit of words and vocabulary that appeared last night. I mean, it's just kind of paltry. And so, like, if you read Casey Lehman's Heavy, this dude had vocabulary. Okay, like you were not growing up in Mississippi not knowing words.
That's right. It was dangerous. It would be dangerous not to know words growing up.
That's right.
Especially as a Black child,
That's right. That's right. All right. Sorry, Allison.
Yes.
No, please don't apologize. This is wonderful, and I don't want it to end. You did invoke the debates. I don't really want to ask you about the debates, but I think you both have been talking about your books as a form of redress. And, you know, Natasha, you said something that's going to stick with me a long time about a little less oblivion for the people that are at the center of these books. And I think about that oblivion and absence and reckoning on a personal level that's so laid out in your writings. But also we are in a moment of a national kind of reckoning as well, right? And in a moment where literally, and that's a context that you bring to these personal stories you're telling. And we're in a reckoning where white supremacy, for example, is literally at the heart of the election, at the contest. And I guess I just want to know what you're thinking about in this current moment, on the eve of this, you know, in the moment that we're in. And you talked about this in some ways about who inspires you, but what would a national reckoning mean for you in terms of these personal stories and this national or collective past that we are all trying to reckon with at this moment?
I mean, we're still such a nation of forgetting, of collective amnesia, willed forgetting and willed amnesia, willed oblivion and willed ignorance. And until, you know, we're ready to have a reckoning for real, like everyone, which means a truth telling and an acknowledgement of our fraught shared history, there can be no reconciliation. There will be no reconciliation without truth. And if this reckoning is trying to push us toward truth, that's great. But we know that there's a great number of folks out there who would still rather truck with willed amnesia and forgetting than an acknowledgement of difficult truth of our shared history.
You know, I agree with that. I don't know that I would say that we're in a moment of reckoning. It's not that fast and not that simple. And I think judging from the past week we've had, that's impossible to say. But maybe one other way of looking at it is when we all live in a world where each of us is required to do the same amount of labor, to know things about the other, that, as Baldwin said, if I know your name, you ought to know mine. And when that starts to happen, when we realize, I think one of the great sort of tragedies of this moment in America is for people to keep treating it as politics. We're way past politics, people. This is about humanity. And to keep framing it as political is to actually live in a world where you are you're having amnesia, you're pretending like you don't know. And I think we're actually quite far from a moment where we're willing to face the truth of the matter, when you have two people on stage who cannot reckon with race, systemic racism, when I think that we have a long way to go. And it does require something that is so big and monstrous, we've never seen it before. And it's going to scare us to get there, but we would have to be willing to go. And everyone would. Everyone would.
Right.
Well, I appreciate you both for, in some ways, helping us to think about how to get there. And thank you, Natasha Trethewey, Sarah Broom, for being with us tonight. It just has been such an honor and a pleasure to hear you both speak. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.